Salmon is in our blood.
DFO is culturally and structurally broken. Current monitoring of stocks consists of counting the fish in some streams and charting the decline. This is a great model to manage to extinction.
For some reason, the Canadian government is ignoring critical warnings that salmon farms are harming wild salmon runs.
I am extremely angry about this situation. It is a management tragedy. The definition of a tragedy is when you learn too late that you should have done things differently.
This week, we are showcasing some of the testimony given during the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans State of the Pacific Salmon sessions. These sessions allowed key persons from all spectrums of the seafood industry in British Columbia, Canada, to share their expertise on the state of Pacific salmon in BC, which is experiencing some of the lowest runs in Canadian history. We created this piece for sharing in hopes that it would cross the desk of Canada's Minister of Fisheries, Bernadette Jordan, and even the desk of current Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, as from what can be heard in the testimony, the industry is in big trouble.
6 minutes or less, please. You're now up.
I'm a non-Indigenous third-generation fisherman living in a small coastal village of Ukiulet on the west coast of Vancouver Island. I spent 40 years trolling for salmon in BC out of this community. I spent 15 years as the chair of a salmon enhancement society. I presently am the executive director of the Area Crab Association, the largest crab fishery in BC. I also own a groundfish longline vessel in partnership with my son and continue to be an active fisherman. As I work on my boat in Ukiulet Harbor, First Nation and non-First Nation fishermen are being set up to fight each other right on the docks in our community over the remaining access to ocean Chinook and coho, while the federal government gives the lion's share of the resource to the commercial recreational fishery with absolutely no transfer mechanism to deal with the disenfranchisement. My longline vessel was tied up this summer after fishing for years for 15% of the landed value of the fish I caught because of the unregulated market created by ITQ management regimes in which much of it is now owned and controlled offshore. I can no longer afford to untie the vessel to go fishing. But I am extremely angry about this situation. It is a management tragedy. The definition of a tragedy is when you learn too late that you should have done things differently. I actually did not want to participate in this call when I first got the invitation. I asked Kathy Scarfo to do it. I am too angry and frustrated to speak anymore about a situation that for 30 years has been ignored by the Pacific region. My head is bloody from beating against that unaccountable, terrible bureaucracy. I'm reminded of something a DFO enforcement person told me when I was occupying a DFO office in Tofino in 1996. He said, "I wake up every morning ashamed that I work for this organization."
I guess 6 minutes to wrap up 30 years worth of fisheries management, fisheries marketing, buying, and being president of the Area G trollers, which are not trawlers, they're the guys that run the single line through the water with hooks on them in different places. The fleet that I manage and have been proud to be a member of and president of for 22 years is a salmon fishery, predominantly Chinook, coho, and sockeye. I think it's important to recognize that when we talk about the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, it is the Department of Fisheries, not just fish. And right now it feels like it's the Department of Foregone Opportunities in Fisheries, because we have economic opportunities that are there that are being foregone because the department is not managing fisheries as their primary mandate. It's more juggling who gets to fish. And we often hear the statement that there's too many boats catching too few fish. No doubt about it, we have massive conservation problems. We have climate change, ocean habitat habitat inland that's not being addressed and not being invested in, salmon enhancement programs that have been gutted. We know all of those things. But on top of that, there are still existing opportunities that would be able to maintain somewhat of a viable fishery. But the juggling of who gets access to those fish and the fact that decisions are not being based on what is absolutely critical in fisheries management, which is first and foremost science and biology, is a major issue. So basically it is the Department of Foregone Opportunities, and I can speak directly to that this year with our fish. We look at solutions to moving forward. If we are looking at solutions to moving forward, I think the first thing to do is recognize that the situation in British Columbia is a disaster, and we need that disaster relief. We need somebody to call it for what it is, and it is a disaster. 90% of the fleet is not going to survive. they're being forced into bankruptcy. And I think in this situation, we need that disaster relief and recognition, because then we can start to address the real problems. The other thing that we need to recognize is that salmon are not caught on the East Coast. This is a 4-year cycle. This is something that can be rebuilt and can have a future. What we need is, rather than lip service from the ministry and the department, is an actual sense of leadership and governance that is to manage fisheries and to try to do their best.
My name is Mirau, and I am the president and CEO of Arrow Trading, a diversified seafood company operating in BC. I, as a processor, exist as our fishermen do by having reliable access to a healthy and sustainable resource. We live or die by the simple access. Issues such as climate, ocean nutrients, habitat, fish farms, weak stock management, predators, past overfishing, and perhaps even underfishing are just a few of the challenges the industry faces now. Throughout this long period of decline of salmon and access in BC, I have made so many trips to Southeast Alaska to visit friends that operate plants there. There were so many similarities to our operations and catches. In fact, we do share many common stocks of fish since we are so close geographically. Fast forward to today and the similarities are mostly gone. 30 years ago, we thought we could rival Alaska in salmon production, but today we're just a shadow of what we once were. And the question is, why? Why have we ended up here now in BC faced with declining salmon runs and reduced access while Alaska continues to experience billions of dollars in economic prosperity from their fisheries? And more importantly, their fish stocks appear more healthy and sustainable than ours. I can't say that I know the answer, but could it be that they spend more on stock assessment and science? They have a more transparent management regime. They have no salmon farms. They have higher harvest rates on salmon runs. These are just a few points we must consider in trying to formulate a plan for our future. And I don't just wish to beat up only on DFO here. In fairness to them, they have a lot on their plate. A lot of their employees work very hard, but over the years, they've taken on too many responsibilities that are political in nature, and they do have a conflict of interest, and the fishing fleet feels this. And in closing, our industry sadly may have to acknowledge that in the short term, we simply may have too many salmon vessels chasing diminished stocks or diminished access, and the necessary time required to rebuild may simply be too long for fishermen to hang on. So in this case, the federal government should offer a fair price to fishermen to retire their salmon license, but do not make them bid against one another to see who is the most desperate. Allow them to retire with some dignities. Those are the government's own words. I'd also like to control the populations of predators like seals and sea lions. I realize this is a controversial subject, but I've seen reports that they consume more seafood than the entire commercial sector combined. I'd like to see more salmon enhancement programs like Alaska has. It just doesn't make sense to me that we don't enhance our stocks. I'd like to at least see a good study of this.
Today I'll be speaking about the state of salmon in BC using my experience with the upper and middle Fraser spring and summer Chinook. I'd like to touch on what is referred to as the 3 H's: harvest, habitat, and hatcheries. While we know that harvest has been reduced in an effort to help these stocks, many reports state that these endangered and threatened stocks in the upper Fraser show a trend that would continue to decline even in the absence of harvest. Coded wire tag data here is 20 plus years old and is known to be incomplete and not meet the requirements of an indicator stock, yet is still currently used to make decisions. Genetic information on the Upper Fraser is also lacking, needs to be refreshed. And lastly on this point, Upper Fraser residents have not seen an opportunity to take part in fisheries for well over a decade. And our local First Nations folks see little to no harvest many years. Despite that, there is recreational harvest in the marine environment and First Nations harvest taking place on the Lower Fraser on these very stocks. Habitat is a tricky one. While the province runs the land base, the feds manage the fish. Habitat will need collaboration. In the Upper Fraser, there's actually many areas where little to no habitat work is needed. However, these areas are vulnerable to riparian degradation. And after an area's timber is harvested or a forest fire goes through, there's no provincial strategy to grow a healthy, resilient forest that could not only provide a strong economic future, but help us meet these conservation targets as well. This conversation needs to happen with everybody at the table. Even agriculture can have a large impact on the health of riparian areas. And lastly, hatcheries. The kind of hatcheries needed for stock rebuilding are not your run-of-the-mill pump out a ton of fish hatcheries. I'm talking about conservation hatcheries that are using strategic enhancement models, including releases at multiple life stages. A knee-jerk reaction to pump out as many fish as possible, like the proposed and cancelled Willow River facility, is no longer the answer. Building a massive hatchery in Upper Fraser is no longer going to make financial or practical sense. Stocks are so low that I believe we would need multiple small facilities. With DFO investment and advice, community and First Nations partners would be able to move these facilities forward and leverage additional funding to increase these programs. Current monitoring of stocks consists of counting the fish in some streams and charting the decline. This is a great model to manage to extinction.
We can't have healthy salmon and salmon runs if we don't have healthy watersheds. Currently, the Fraser is threatened by cumulative impacts, a changing climate, overconsumption of resources, habitat destruction from urban development and resource extraction, loss of biodiversity, excess pollution, lack of regulation, monitoring, and enforcement, reduced funding for watershed CPR, and impacts from open net salmon farm. Lack of government action on watershed CPR has left Fraser River salmon on life support. It's clear past federal governments have failed wild Pacific salmon. Some witnesses have asserted the department is broken. While I won't weigh in on that, I will say the department is a reflection of political will and leadership. Members of this committee are well aware of the problems facing West Coast wild salmon, and I'd bet you could all agree on most of the needed solution. You've heard enough testimony from witnesses to clearly recommend what action the government needs to take to address the problems facing West Coast wild salmon. Witnesses have pointed out the political arm of the government needs to give the bureaucratic arm a fighting chance with bold leadership, resources, and support. One witness clearly stated the government needs to take action, and he clearly identified a NOME framework, as you've just heard: harvest, habitat, and hatcheries. Support science-based conservation-oriented harvest levels. Act on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Investigate what is taking place in international waters with regard to our Canadian wild Pacific salmon. Make a bold investment in habitat and restoration and protection. BC SHRIF and the Coastal Restoration Fund and other programs are a good start, but inadequate to solve the problem. And address issues associated with industrial hatcheries and open net salmon farms. Immediately transition to safe and efficient land-based closed containment.
My advice, which I'm sure has never been heard or listened to before, but I'm going to say it again. My advice would be that to dismantle the entire organization and start again with proper governance and real consultation, not the sham that is presently being used by this government department.
We need a department that is basically based on some principles, and some of those need to be fair and equitable, and a transfer mechanism that is actually being used, because otherwise we are pitting user groups and basically fighting over the crumbs of what is left for opportunities. In a conflict of interest, they are managing buybacks at the same time managing opportunities, which means that basically you bankrupt the fleet and then you offer them the lowest amount of money that they're willing to take because they're forced into bankruptcy.
So here's my recommendations to you. Create a Pacific region director of wild salmon. We need somebody at a senior management level in DFO whose whole life is focusing on restoring wild salmon. And this must be done in partnership with First Nations.
That significant new investment is required into the 3H levers: harvest, hatcheries, and habitat. New dollars need to go into DFO as well as to collaborators and partners, and the management system needs to be revitalized. Consideration should be given to an independent oversight body to complement the work that DFO and other regulatory agencies are bringing forward.
And we know the problems. You've heard many of them already this morning. Viruses and parasites from salmon farms, overfishing, the harmful effects of salmon hatcheries, habitat destruction and pollution, and of course climate change, which is upending water flow and temperature patterns and degrading the salmon's food sources. And all of these problems have been exacerbated by a chronic management dysfunction that Mr. Zeman spoke to and has been described along with remedies in a long series of public inquiries and official policy papers spanning over the past several decades. So the solutions are there.
The department, First Nations, the province, and community need to work together to move forward on this. No one organization will be able to do it alone. This is a complex issue. There's no silver bullet. Salmon are disappearing due to a death by 1,000 cuts situation. Long-term commitments will need to be made with a recovery plan and conservation targets in place, or else we will see populations disappear. I will note that it's not too late to rebuild, to update the science, and to make these changes to help these fish thrive, but we need to work with the fish and together, not against them and not against each other. Every year wasted will make this issue more difficult and very much more expensive.
Fisheries and Oceans Canada, there have been hours of testimony already given with more to come as the sessions continue. So what will you do? If you are not already, be sure to subscribe to our 3-Minute Market Insight using the sign-up form below to keep tuned into all our upcoming market insights. Thank you for joining me for the Tradex Foods 3-Minute Market Insight. This has been Kyla Ganton reminding you to stay safe, buy smart, and eat more seafood.